Well, the scourge of gender-based violence, the impact of COVID-19 on women, as well as the issues of social grants, came under the spotlight at the Gauteng Provincial Legislature's annual Women's Parliament yesterday. A 20-year-old Wits University student, Asithandile Kwasa Zozo, died allegedly at the hands of her boyfriend on Monday. Kwasa's name has been added on a number of gender-based violence cases reported since the beginning of Women's Month. To take this discussion further, we're now joined on the line by the Director for Rise Up Against Gender-Based Violence, Vanita Daniels. A very warm welcome to you, Vanita, and thank you so very much for joining us here on SA Today.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
Now it's Women's Month, and of course, we've been having these discussions, engagements, more than usual around the scourge of gender-based violence, but still it persists. And one in fact hears that things have been in fact worse for women since we began having a lockdown. What now?
Yeah, it's sad that we constantly having to have this conversation. We constantly having to hashtag the names of women and children who've lost their lives due to gender-based violence and femicide. Yeah. And I mean, the minister released the crime stats last month, and there's been an increase in these type of crimes. And so I think it's a good question to say, what now? I mean, activists have been calling for changes in terms of society. We've been calling for changes in terms of criminal justice system. But really the main question is, what do we do now? Where do we, honestly, as somebody in the sector, one can get a little bit demotivated because it's sad and it's heartbreaking to have to listen and hear the names of women and children who've lost their lives every single day.
Yeah. Can I just point out one problem that I've picked up? We're having these conversations and we're having them with women. So essentially what we're doing is really sort of preaching to the choir. Should we not be, having real male participation and having the involvement of men as we have these sort of discussions, these panels, all these things that we're talking about? Or should we not be having those who should be hearing the messages of what's happening? Are they even listening to those conversations that are being had in the first place?
I think it's important. As our organization, for instance, Rise Up, we've for the month of August and I think September, and probably up until 16 days of activism ends, we are going to be having dialogues with men, young men, in taverns to talk about gender-based violence and to talk about social behavioral change. And so I think as a society, because there are other organizations who do this as well, but I think that there's not enough. I think there's not enough men who come to the table. Because when we have these conversations, ultimately what we start talking about is how do we change your perception as a man about women and children in general, about you as a man? What does that mean these days to be a man in society? And so we actually need to start having those conversations. And I think that's important. And we also need to look at how we need to also start taking away the conversation of gender-based violence from just a perpetrator and a survivor or victim. We need to start asking ourselves as a society, how do we perpetuate creating this sort of perfect storm for the scourge of GBV to continue? What are we doing as churches? What are we doing as universities, as schools? What are we doing in our own families? And I think because the conversation is so hard to have, we're having a difficulty in actually having that conversation. I mean, our most recent, the young student from Wits, when you read about some of the comments where family and friends have told her to go back to the perpetrator only for her to end up dead. And so, we have to also take a look at ourselves as society and say, what are we doing as a society that perpetuates the scourge?
Yeah. The different types of and forms of gender-based violence, which I'm sure in your work you've kind of had to go into all of them. I mean, it's the ones that we usually talk about, of course, which are rape, sexual assault, physical assault, psychological and emotional abuse, as well as forced marriage. One which was interesting that really popped up was the denial of resources or opportunities or services, which I found quite interesting that it has also then been listed. Can you talk to us about this and how it really adds to the scourge of gender-based violence, the fact that women are really sort of denied resources and opportunities or services? I mean, the fact that it's been put on the list surely means that it is very significant.
Yeah, it is. I mean, during lockdown, one of the things that we were doing as an organization was providing an emergency evacuation service because it was difficult for victims to actually leave their homes with the perpetrator there. And so what we would do is we would then, once they had contacted us, we would then activate the SAPs and we would go with them to their homes and we would help the survivors pack and leave with the children if there was. And so what you then found was that women was then placed in shelters. They were removed from their homes. They were removed from their livelihoods. And so so for instance, as an organization, we are calling for men to be placed in shelters. They are the perpetrators. And obviously, in addition to that there needs to be some psychosocial support that is provided to perpetrators as well. And so you find that a lot of times, for instance, access to sexual reproductive health services means that women end up having unwanted pregnancies and having babies and resorting to backdoor abortions and all of those things. And so it becomes really, really difficult when we just talk about all of these social security systems that are supposed to be in place that makes it extremely difficult for women to access. Things like just being involved in your local community, for instance, when we have, when municipalities have local community meetings, the times that they have those meetings means that women, because they are seen to be the caregivers, need to stay at home and look after the kids while the men go and talk about politics and what is happening within their community and talking about services. And so I think, for instance, it's incumbent upon government to have a gendered focus when they look at budgets and how they allocate services and how they allocate resources. But it is a massive problem.
One of the things, and you just sort of touched on it now, the fact that you ran this program where you were sort of evacuating a woman from dangerous situations. A woman, and particularly one who is a mother, who's watching this and thinking, look, if I'm going to be moved from here, nobody wants to see their children go hungry. They don't want to go hungry. And this perhaps abusive man is the one that, sort of pays for everything, owns the house, all of that. What do you say to a woman, in that situation who's kind of saying, look, I have to stay here for the sake of, my children, so my children don't go hungry, or myself, and for, a roof over our heads? I mean, these are the actual realities, aren't they?
Yeah, it is. And I think, especially during COVID, the whole inadequate system that we have as a response to gender-based violence was brought out in the limelight once again. Let me just make an example. One of the survivors that contacted us, and we actually spoke probably to her for about 3 days, where we were in constant communication with her. And her concern was she was being beaten. She was pregnant and she was being beaten by her partner because he did not want the pregnancy and she wanted the pregnancy. So he was beating her. And she asked, but are you coming to get me with my stuff? And so we were unable to do that. Also, the shelter wasn't going to take you with all of your furniture and everything. And so her question, which was a legitimate question, was, well, where do I go? And what happens to me when the 3 months shelter stay is up. Also, I don't know where the shelter is going to be, so I don't know how far I'm going to be from work. What about the children and school? And so the system is just wholly inadequate in terms of how we respond to gender-based violence, because we don't look at the victims and survivors holistically. And if there is somebody out there right now listening and wondering what they need to do, I'm really going to ask them to tap into their network of support. That's one. Contact various organizations. Obviously, our organization is one of them. There's the various hotlines. Call your SABC. I mean, we give the usual responses, and we know that some of those responses are wholly inadequate in terms of how they respond. Even when we were dealing with SAPs, we had such varied responses in terms of how the SAPs officials would assist and would help us with each and every case. And so it was almost an individual SAPs official needed to be really committed to doing their job and needed to be really interested and wanting to help for them to do the necessary and go above and beyond. I mean, one of our cases where we went to assist a survivor in leaving, my colleague Mandisa had to act as a human shield between the perpetrator and the survivor, even with the SAPS officials there. And they were basically just saying, well, we're here to make sure that you don't get hurt. Yeah. But they did not get involved. They did not talk to the perpetrator. That was left up to us to talk this very violent man down from trying to attack this woman while we were trying to extract her.
I mean, these are really very concerning stories that you're telling us of, and we certainly do appreciate the work that we're doing, and we hope certainly from these types of conversations that we're having that more attention will be brought to the kind of work that you do, and you do indeed get the support that indeed you are seeking and asking for. We thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for the work that you are doing as we try to tackle this scourge of gender-based violence. Vanita Daniels, thank you.